Good afternoon and welcome back. NCR is a news organization, and so we're interrupting our regular scheduled program for a news bulletin. No, seriously. This afternoon, our afternoon time, as we're meeting in the morning, the Synod Fathers, as they're called, were voting on a document in Rome. And our Vatican team was on call covering that event, waiting for the document to be released. And our web editors were in Kansas City waiting for our Vatican people to file their stories. And the first story appeared on the website about 12:28 p.m. this afternoon, and Josh McElwee is continuing to update it this afternoon. But I wanted to share this with you because it's quite dramatic. The headline reads, Synod offers striking softening to remarried. Proposing individual discernment. Please. Vatican City Dateline. The worldwide gathering of some 270 Catholic bishops has strikingly softened the Church's practice towards those who have divorced and remarried, saying such persons should discern their decisions about their spiritual lives individually. Okay. Individually in concert with the guidance of priests. Okay. Now you. Okay. Although the final document says discernment for remarried persons can, quote, never overlook the demands of truth and love in the gospel, unquote, it seems to significantly move decision-making for how they can participate in the Church to private conversations in dioceses around the world. Suggesting use of what's called the internal forum, the document says priests can help remarried Catholics in, quote, becoming conscious of their situation before God and then deciding how to move forward. Josh reports that the 3 paragraphs in the document, each paragraph was voted on. It needed a 2/3 majority to pass. They needed 177 votes to pass. The three paragraphs that addressed the remarriage issue received respectively 187, 178, and 190 votes. Just one last paragraph here. In closing the meeting, Pope Francis reissued a strong renewal of his continual emphasis of the boundless nature of divine mercy, saying, quote, the Church's first duty is not to hand down condemnations or anathemas, but to proclaim God's mercy, end quote.
Thank you, Dennis. And thank you, Josh. And thank you all the team back in Kansas City posting this online. If I could just do a quick business that I'm always supposed to do, that's the kind of news you guys are going to get from NCR. So what do we need to make sure that you're always going to get that kind of news, that your kids and your grandchildren will always get that kind of news? We need funding. So whatever you can do to help us out in this new campaign would be most appreciated. Had to do it. But thank you, Dennis. Okay, going on to our afternoon presentation, which I am assured will be equally as strong as the first morning. I started at NCR 2 years ago, actually 2 years ago this summer, and when I came to NCR, I thought I was already pretty challenged as a woman in this church and about my feelings with the church, and then I met Jamie Manson. So we look forward to hearing what she has to say right now. Jamie Manson.
Thanks very much. It's interesting to get that news right before I come up because my earliest memory of church is my first Holy Communion, and two things are forever emblazoned in my mind. This first was how much I did not want to be wearing a dress, and the second was watching my mother as the only parent that was not allowed to receive communion at my first Holy Communion. Yeah. She was divorced and remarried outside the church, and said to the priest, can I please receive communion at my daughter's first Holy Communion? And he said to her, no, you're excommunicated. And as recently as a week ago, I was talking to my mother, and she said, I'm excommunicated. I was like, Mom. It stays with you. It stays with you. But I also think of that as the birth of my vocation in that moment, and at 8 years old, watching my mother, thank you. Watching my mother get sent away hungry from the table, and that's been a very big theme for my entire life and my work and my writing. So I want to thank NCR for asking me to be on this very distinguished roster of speakers. That's a little overwhelming to be among these three other folks. Thanks to Dominican University, who've been incredibly hospitable, and for giving me the very rare experience of speaking on a Catholic campus. Wow. I never get to do that anymore. The topic I chose, what might the new face of the church look like, came out of my own, when I'm speaking around the country at Protestant churches, talking to Catholics at Protestant churches, as I do. The biggest question I get, even more than anything having to do with sex, is what is the future of the church? Where are our young adults? Where are they going? Where are they? And so I thought it was a really important conversation to have in this forum. Because if the studies are to be believed, the new face of the church won't have much of a face at all. According to a recent Pew Research poll, only 15% of American millennials define their religion as Catholic, and another 10% say they're only culturally Catholic. 9% say they've already left the church. Various studies find that anywhere from 15% to 30% of young Catholics go to Mass weekly. And last year, as you may recall, these great headlines heralding the rise of the nones, the N-O-N-E-S, when Pew did this major study about the religious landscape in America, finding that 35% of millennials identify as a nun. And nun is an umbrella term meaning they're either atheist, agnostic, or unaffiliated from church. 35%. 23% of the adult population, but 35% specifically of millennials. Now, if you read my column in the NCR, you know that pretty frequently. I'm quite critical of the institutional church. So you may find the following statement a shock. I don't think the church is primarily to blame for the die-off in interest in institutional religion. Tell your friends. I think it has far more to do with our culture's shift from a communal model of society to an individualistic model of society. Oh, good, you agree. Super. Over the past 3 generations, U.S. culture has undergone this radical transformation in which the needs of the individual, rather than the needs of the community, are of primary importance. And though it may sound like an exaggeration, today's young adults are living in a cultural milieu that is without precedent. To explain this in an interesting way, I like to present it in terms of my own family's experience over the last 3 generations. So if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a bit about my own ancestry. My maternal grandparents were born in Italy in the early 1920s. They immigrated to the U.S. through Ellis Island as small children. My mother was born in 1950, and I was born in 1977. So I'm kind of on the cusp of millennial Generation X. Now, when you look at the different worlds in which our three generations were raised, the comparisons are actually pretty astonishing. My immigrant grandparents grew up in the traditional model of family, the village model. That's how most human beings lived in the U.S. up until the 1960s. They lived in a world in which one's individuality wasn't nearly as important as their community. Their families, their extended families, their communities gave them their identity. Their religious traditions were handed on to them. They were expected to sacrifice their own desires for the needs of their community. They were given their moral code. That was my grandparents' world. They were assigned very strict gender roles. My grandmother had an 8th grade education, and then she had to stop because she had to work because they were very poor. And from the moment she was born, her life was really already prescribed. She was supposed to find an Italian husband. She was going to have children, who of course the family had to approve of. She was going to have children, be a housewife, and that was it. And my grandfather had a similarly prescribed life. He was going to get a job, find an Italian woman that the family approved of, and he was going to provide. And these roles were really not alterable. The minute my grandparents got married, they moved in with their extended families, and even when they were able to buy their own home, they had to live on the same block as their brothers and sisters and their parents, all in Queens, on one block in Queens, New York. They lived in a community, they lived in a village, and that's the way human beings have been socialized up until very, very recently. And really outside of the US and many countries in Europe, most of the world still lives on this communal model. Now, my mother was born in 1950, so she grows up during that great time of change and upheaval of the 60s. Her life began in the old world where gender roles were very strict, but by the time she's in her late teens, the women's struggle for equality is in full swing, the birth control pill starts to become available, and the loosening of gender roles starts to take place. Greater numbers of women began to seek out higher education. Eventually, men and women could live independently. They didn't depend on one another to survive the way they did with my grandparents' time. People married for love. As well as that went, we don't know yet. But it could be part of the reason for the high divorce rate. But so began our cultural shift from the communal model to the individual model. Now, today's young adults, like me, are born into this individualistic culture where the community does not necessarily tell them who they are. They don't tell them what to believe. They have the right individually to decide what they believe in, what their values are, how they're going to live their lives. And that kind of individuality is unprecedented in human history. I don't think you can discount it. We can't overestimate the impact this has had on the church. The church has always thrived in communal culture. Communities relied on the church to give them their religious identity, their religious beliefs, their moral code, even their political beliefs. The church and the community defined an individual's identity, and the desires of the individual were never superior to those of the community. But now most young adults in the U.S. are raised in an individualistic world. Some of them were raised by parents who told them, you don't have to go to church. Some were told, choose your own religion when you get older. I can't imagine my grandparents being told that, my grandfather being told to go find himself. Unthinkable. They did as they were told, what the community expected of them. They weren't told to choose the religion that made them happy. Young people today decide and define what their values and beliefs are. They aren't inculcated into religious and communal traditions like their ancestors. So it's a radical departure. And it's one of the key reasons why we're not seeing young people in church and why it's so hard to get young people into church. Young people are growing up surrounded by a spiritual marketplace. Everything from our traditional religions to Bikram yoga to Zen meditation to Oprah's Super Soul Sunday is competing for their time and money, all with the promise of helping them find meaning in life. And young people get to shop around, figure out what their beliefs will be. And the culture has placed tremendous stress on traditional religions like the Roman Catholic Church, which never in its history had to try to woo new members. never had to reach out and make itself desirable, the Catholic Church, because people went to church because the fate of their souls depended on it. That's what my mother grew up learning. She grew up in that communal model, that old world, where the church still had that kind of power, that deeply influential power over morality and religious beliefs. The very new requirement that churches suddenly have to attract young people with good music, good preaching, good programs, and retain them is brand new, and it's at the heart of the challenge. They never had to do this before. This doesn't just affect the Roman Catholic Church. Mainline Protestant churches have the same exact struggles. Their numbers are falling off rapidly. Even evangelicals are struggling to retain young adults. Studies show that when these young evangelicals go to college, they start to lose their connection with their churches. And that's remarkable because evangelicals tend to be really good with youth ministry. So even those more absolutist types of religions are struggling to figure out how to attract and retain young people. Traditional religions never had to do this. They never had to compete in a spiritual marketplace. There's also a change in the way in which we communicate in our individualistic culture, and technology is exacerbating this. We don't share communal meals together the way we used to. We're not physically present to each other the way we used to. Our communication has become fractured. We used to talk over the phone, and though the voice was disembodied, there was still some intimacy in hearing someone's voice. Now we pray for voicemail, if we have to actually leave a voice message at all. Or we communicate with email or text messages. And it's such a fragmented way to communicate. There's no intimacy in it. 160 characters, tell me what you want or where you want me to be, and I'll let you know, I'll respond. This is a terrible breakdown in our presence to one another. We can be in contact with one another in a variety of ways at any moment of the day, but our communication, which comes from the root word of the meaning communion, to be one with, is eroding. There are great benefits to individualistic culture. It has a lot of personal freedom. It can be free of patriarchal structures in the way that communal structures cannot be. It's based on equality and equal opportunity and equal voice. But as wonderful as this is, there are significant losses that happen in this kind of culture. As free and contactable as we are deeply hungry for presence and community. And I really see this among young adults. With Twitter, with Facebook, they are longing to be known. That's always the sense I get when I read Facebook and tweets. In many ways, the deprivation of presence is greater than in any previous generation. There is such a serious lack of intimacy in their lives. Most significantly, for the first time in human history, young adults aren't born into a community that will surround them and support them, whether they want them or not, for the rest of their lives. Today's young adults have to go out and build and seek their own communities. That's an extraordinary burden and an extraordinary challenge. A few years ago, I was teaching an introductory religion class at a Catholic college, and I would give the students an assignment. I told them to design their own religion, and almost every student I taught was a baptized Catholic, and yet almost none of them created a religion with rituals or with a priesthood. There was one common factor, though. Almost every student's religion offered an opportunity to get together in small groups and talk to one another about their spiritual lives. I came to the conclusion that sitting and talking with a small group offers them not only what's lacking for them in church, but also in our culture: community, intimacy, presence. The irony, of course, is that community, intimacy, and presence are what our whole Eucharistic tradition is about. Isn't that what Eucharistic community is supposed to offer us? But my students couldn't make that connection. This isn't to say that young adults aren't interested in ritual. Those who still go to church, or at least long to find a good church where they can be happy, express a desire to be part of something greater than themselves, to connect with a tradition, with a legacy, with a history. How can't they? Growing up in this culture that's not only individualistic, but no doubt feels rootless and in constant flux. The issue is that the rituals of the church do not seem relevant to the lives of many young Catholics. And I say this with the full knowledge that this is true of not young Catholics either. Many of us of many generations are struggling to figure out what the relevance of these rituals still are. Years ago, in his book Sacramental Theology, the Franciscan theologian Kennan Osborne wrote, "We must find Jesus not just in the table of the Eucharist, but in the world around us. If we do not see Jesus in the table of the world, we really will not find Jesus in the table of the Eucharist." And though Osborne wasn't talking about young adults or the future of the church, his beautifully worded insight, I think, speaks to this decline in the relevance of the church's rituals among U.S. Catholics, especially young adults. When young adults are taught to connect their lives in the world with the church's symbols, the rituals can take on profound meaning. I actually read an example of this once. One of my classmates from Divinity School, name is Alice Kearney, she wrote a piece in America Magazine. Sorry. And moving right along. It was called Christ and the Cooks. And in it, Alice described her work as a director of youth and young adult ministry at a large parish in the Diocese of Trenton, New Jersey. That could not have been easy. Over and over, she heard young adults claim that going to church was not feeding them. So her strategy was to invite them to share a meal and teach them how to cook it, given the explosive popularity of the Food Network. She organized cooking classes for 21 to 35-year-olds as a way to jumpstart the parish's long dormant young adult ministry. The meals were chosen for their catechetical potential. One week they baked bread from scratch and enjoyed wine tasting. Another time they simmered soup in the monastic style and talked about Sabbath rest in a busy world. One week was devoted to making a meal to be delivered to a local shelter for women and children. Alice writes, "Over the course of the cooking class, I found that our little community had become a communion, and individual members came to support and minister to each other. They were more than just friendly faces to see at Mass. They enriched the parish experience for one another. Not only did their Mass attendance increase, they sat together at Mass." Victory. They experienced Jesus in the table of the world, in the communication that was essential in their growing friendships, in their deepening presence to one another. They created communion, and suddenly Eucharist made so much more sense. It inspired them to go to Mass. I believe that these young people began to experience what I think is one of the richest aspects of the Catholic tradition, and that is our sacramental understanding of the world. Oh, thank you very much. I agree. In his book, Why Stay Catholic, Michael Leach, and great NCR writer, wrote, "Catholicism is about seeing what the eyes cannot see and understanding what is at the heart of things. Truth, love, mercy, goodness, beauty, harmony, humility, compassion, gratitude, joy, peace. Catholicism is about seeing the ordinary and perceiving the extraordinary at the same time." And while the Catholic tradition has 7 big S sacraments, I gave this talk recently to young adults, and they said, "We have big ass sacraments in the Catholic Church?" I have learned to enunciate better since then. So while our tradition has 7 big S sacraments, our sacramental view of the world makes it so that we have countless small s sacraments that we give and receive every moment of our lives. Catholic theology teaches us that the finite is capable of the infinite, that all that God created is good, and that every being participates in the being of God. As my mentor Margaret Farley wrote, God speaks God's word in all of creation. Therefore, all things in creation are capable of revealing God's presence to us. Catholic theology teaches that grace perfects nature. So human beings and God are in this dynamic relationship. We are co-creators with God. We're called to be visible signs of God's presence in our world, in our actions, in our relationships, in our encounters. For the Catholic, God's presence is everywhere and nothing falls out of God's embrace. I love that notion of the human person, creation, and God. It helps me still make meaning of my life every day. And for that reason, I still call myself a Catholic, even though thousands of commenters have decided I am not. And even amid my many struggles with the church doctrine around women and sexuality. I think this sacramental view of the world is at the core of what many people still identify with the church. I think it's the seed of so much of their love for the church, even among so much struggle. I would even venture to say that the sacramental view of the world helps us to explain the extraordinary popularity of Pope Francis, especially among young people. People aren't compelled so much by watching Pope Francis perform big S sacraments as they are watching him perform little s sacraments in countless videos, photos, tweets that have gone around the world, embracing the sick, the disfigured, the suffering, washing the feet of the imprisoned, taking selfies with young people. I believe that the disconnect among Catholics between the big S and the little s sacraments is clearly demonstrated by the fact that the Francis effect has not translated into any substantial increase in church attendance or increased commitment to participating in the life of the institutional church. Catholics are compelled by little s sacraments, but cannot connect them to the big S sacraments. And a big part of that is, in fact, the fault of the institutional church. You knew that was coming. Though our theological tradition calls us to be visible signs of the very life of God in our world and among those in our communities, too often the institutional church is more of a visible sign of exclusion rather than a reflection of God's justice. Parishes close because of a lack of priests, while so many gifted women, married men, out gays and lesbians stand idle. They're unable to answer God's call fully in the church because of this terrible obstacle the institution puts between God and God's beloved people. Lay people who give so much of their spirits to the life of the church have no collaborative roles in the structures and decision-making of the church. Same-sex couples are refused the possibility of having the sacramentality of their relationships recognized and honored. Too many Catholics still believe they must not take communion and go away hungry from the table. So much deprivation, and for no good reason. I know many Catholics, especially young adults, cannot bring themselves to participate in a religious community that codifies and sanctions exclusion like this. Some theologians have suggested that the future of the church is outside the walls of the institutional church. And I think they're really onto something. I think the whole idea of the sacramental view of the world is so life-giving and can be so life-giving for young adults if we can start to figure out how to communicate it to them in ever richer ways. If we begin to help them see that sacraments don't just happen within the walls of the church, but rather if you really believe this Catholic idea, then God's table is everywhere in the world. God is reaching out to us in all of creation, seeking communion with us, hoping that we will find communion with one another. I think young adults will understand this because so many of them are already doing sacramental work in the table of the world, and so many of them don't even know it. Countless young adults are already doing this work with commitment, passion, and sacrifice. They labor in homeless shelters and domestic violence shelters, hospitals and hospices, group homes and addiction recovery centers. They work abroad in war-torn squalor, locally in rundown inner-city basements. They're empowering poor mothers, educating children, aiding undocumented immigrants, planting rooftop gardens in the projects, feeding the hungry in pantries, soup kitchens, and nursing homes. They are confronting our broken world and longing to bring wholeness. So many of these young people who have turned away from Catholicism are honoring the dignity of human life, fighting for justice, sacrificing to serve on the margins of society. And by doing this, they are doing the traditional work of the church. But most of them would not even think to call their work church or a spiritual discipline. They wouldn't recognize that by living and working on the margins, they are creating a sacramental life. They're doing the work mandated by the gospel, but many of them don't even know to see it that way. They might even be taken aback if you told them that. But they are creating and participating in the life of the church outside the walls of the church. Now, of course, this model of doing the sacramental work outside the walls is not new. In many ways, women religious have already given us a model of this church outside the walls of the church. They have incarnated the reality that the church is at its very best when it's working on the margins. Women religious consecrate their lives not only to living out the teachings of the gospel, but also to following Jesus' command to read the signs of the times. The work that women religious do is decades, if not centuries, ahead of the male hierarchy. They have created among themselves the church that so many Catholics are restless for. Small, supportive, non-hierarchical, intimate communities, grounded in the sacramental life and outreach to the marginalized. In many ways, the sisters have built the church of the future already. I think there's a very significant untapped place for women religious to support young adults. Though they may not be ready to take traditional vows, young adults would benefit tremendously from getting to know women religious, witnessing their deeply Catholic lives, Catholic in the best sense of the word, feeling the support of their communities, enriching their spiritual practices by learning about their charisms and their collected wisdom. So many young adults long for a safe sacramental space. Women religious could offer them the opportunity to explore being Catholic in this very true and deep and beautiful sense of the word. In addition to women religious, there are countless non-vowed women and men who are doing the work of justice and compassion, the true work of the church throughout our world. They're not always in the institutional church or even in the parish, but these men and women are modeling the work to which God calls us in their service in hospitals, prisons, schools, community centers, anywhere God longs to be made present. I believe that these servant leaders are the key to the future of the church. They can guide new generations in understanding what it means to bring about the very life of God in this broken world. This is spiritual leadership that I think will truly speak to new generations of people who are much less compelled by parish structures and traditional devotions, but who are most definitely interested in committing their lives to working on the margins. We must teach them that their work can be graced and a spiritual practice. Studies have shown that though Pope Francis is popular among young adults, this has not translated into increased church attendance. Catholics are feeling good about the Pope, but not good enough to go back to Mass. Or perhaps they've tried to go back to Mass and learned that not much has actually changed on the ground in the parishes. Just because young adults aren't gravitating toward the church doesn't mean they have any less of a need for community, for a sense of meaning, for a system of values and beliefs, spiritual mentors who will walk them through their rites of passage. Sadly, like many of us, they continue to be sent away empty from the church. We spend a lot of time, particularly in the pages of NCR, energy, it's a good paper, right? The only one that'll have me in their pages, I'll tell you that. We spend a lot of time and energy worrying, analyzing, writing, and arguing about the institutional church. But we must not become so preoccupied with the church of our dreams that we fail to notice the flourishing church that we can and do create already for one another. I believe progressive Catholics would do well to take some of that energy behind our righteous anger at our bishops or our wild hopes for the Pope and use that energy to discover the myriad ways that we are already church, in our work, in our families, in our communities. We must discover all the ways in which we bring the very life of God into our world. We must discover all of the ways that we are doing the traditional work of the church, even if it is outside the walls of the institution. We can spin our wheels all day about what Pope Francis will and will not do, what our bishop said and did not say. But the truth is, people are hungry now. They need to be fed now. Jesus called us to feed them now, and it is getting very late. What are we going to do about it? That's the question. If in our words and in our work we are mirroring the teachings of the gospel, then together we have already created church and are longing for communion, searching for the sacred, hungering for meaning. It's this ability to see the presence of Jesus not only in the Eucharistic table, but also in the table of the world. That makes us Catholic. Our sacramental view of the world teaches us that it is impossible to tell where the church begins and where it ends, if it ever really ends at all. The only criteria is whether our work deepens our love for one another and brings about the life of God more fully in our world and helps us to attune our vision to see God at work in all things. We must get rid of that hierarchical baggage that compels us to declare what is and is not church, where God can and cannot be. I just don't think future generations are going to work in those kind of categories. Together, we need to explore the ways in which we already are church and to enhance the opportunities to become more fully church, with or without the hierarchy. We need to discover what the sacred experiences are that we're hungering for and what brings us that more abundant life that Jesus taught us to seek. Our sacramental view of the world opens our eyes to this. And together we need to recognize that the new face of the church that we seek is already among us. Thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Heidi Schlumpf. I'm back again to comment, and I want to thank again Jamie for her inspirational words. I love reading Jamie's column online and sometimes in print, and she's always challenging. I think sometimes she and I are known as the rebels within NCR, and if you're a rebel within NCR, that's pretty bad, I think. The rebel within the rebel. Once again, I'm not sure why I was asked to respond to this lecture because just like I'm not a person of color, I'm also not a young person. So I got a good decade plus on Jamie, but I do teach young people. I'm the parent of some potential young people. And when I was a young person, I had a lot of opinions about being a young adult in the church, so I've kind of moved on from being that, though. So first of all, I wanted to congratulate Jamie for first of all saying she wasn't going to blame the church, but then eventually coming around to saying that the church can do things better. I don't think we should let the church off the hook, even if there are societal issues that are contributing to our declining numbers. So, and I do agree about those declining numbers, and I've written about the nuns as well, N-O-N-E-S. I think there are some in our church that are still in denial, grasping to little pieces of good news about a number of seminarians here or a number of young adult Catholics there to try to convince themselves that we aren't facing a problem of huge proportions, and I think Jamie's right on target in saying it is. This issue of individualism and collectivism in our culture was really of interest to me. I teach that in a course on intercultural communication where we look at different cultures and how they value individualism or collectivism. I think we have to be careful not to idealize collectivistic cultures, and I think Jamie was right to point out there are some really good things about an individualistic culture, lack of as much patriarchy, increased roles for women. But also I just sometimes wonder if there is that level, such an increased level of intimacy in collectivistic cultures as we think there is, just because they all live so close together and there is that community there, at least externally, I wonder if it always translated to a real depth of intimacy, at least not for everyone there. I think the U.S. has always been somewhat individualistic, even if it did ratchet up a little bit in the 60s. But I think what we're seeing today or recently is a rampant individualism that Jamie has correctly identified as a real problem. I'd call it a soul sickness, like Father Massengill was describing racism this morning. I'm going to disagree with her about social media, and she knows I will because I'm a pro-technology person. Is it fragmented communication? Yes. But I think social media and technology has the potential to bring people together. Quick example, so your homilist for tonight, Nicole Sotelo, needed a ride today. She posted it on Facebook a couple weeks ago. She and I messaged through Facebook, and we enjoyed a nice ride together today. So it can't replace in-person communication, but I don't think we should be too anti-technology. In fact, a lot of those young people you were describing who are doing all that good work on the margins are using social media and technology to do it. Okay, let me see what else do I have. Oh, here we go. Sacramentality. Yes, I'm for sacramentality, big S and small s. And I do think it's that hunger for sacramentality that Jamie correctly identified that is causing young people to have that, I think it's interesting, burden of having to create it for themselves because the institutions aren't doing it for them. There are some positives to that too, because I think it can help people own their communities more if they've helped create them. I think it's true that our church is still perceived as exclusive and will be as long as maybe I can tie this, and will be perceived as exclusive when we are excited that the church now says that divorced and remarried people can search their own consciences about whether they can go to communion. If that's good news, then we're going to still be perceived, I think, as exclusive, because I did that a long time ago. But I am also saddened about this inability to connect the small s sacraments to the big S sacraments, and I don't know exactly how we should do that either. Being less exclusive is one start. I think we need to market what's good about our tradition a little bit better too. I'm really intrigued by and agree with Jamie's idea about the importance of small groups and doing the work of the church outside the walls. I've been involved in a small group spiritual community for 20 years. It's been really important in my life. A number of young adult women when we were in our 30s. Interestingly, I think almost all of us came from a Catholic background. I'm the only one left out of that group of 9 to still have any connection to the institutional Catholic Church. One other person is a little bit sort of still connected. But I don't think small groups can solve everything either. I think we do need to be part of something bigger, and Jamie noted that as well. Like, it doesn't have to be either or, it can be both and. In some ways, a small group seems to me, maybe, and I haven't thought this through a lot, but isn't that something of an individualistic answer to a problem created by individualism? So like find our own little community that works for us or that where we can, make a difference. I do love this quote, "We must not become so preoccupied with the church of our dreams that we fail to notice the flourishing church we can and do create for one another." Gets me choked up just reading it. And if we really don't believe where the church begins and ends, then in the end, a lot of those dire numbers won't matter to us so much anymore. So thank you for giving us so much to think about.
Yeah, Jamie, again, thank you very much for your reflections, for your, not just today, but every time you file a story, a column with NCR. Truly, thank you very much for that. And Heidi, also, thanks for what you do for us. I wouldn't describe Heidi and Jamie as rebels in NCR, but they have brought us back to an even keel more than once, and for that I'm very grateful. And again, there's so much here to be discussed. Something, and on a kind of a personal level with me, what's happening with me is connected with my parish back at home. We're in the process of a major capital campaign to build a new church. And any of you who have ever gone through that know the blessings and the difficulties that come with something like that. Because, and I say blessings because this is the one thing that really surprised me as we're going through this process in my home church, to raise $8 million to build a church structure. And I've got enough Catholic worker influence and background in me to cringe at the idea of spending that much money on a building. And I've got enough theological training in small Christian community ideas to wonder if we need a parish that is going to hold 1,300 families. And yet, in the midst of that, we've had people that come up and kind of testify about why we should be tithing and stuff like that. And I walk away in awe at the blessings that individuals have received from that parish that I belong to. How individuals have been walked through, the death of a spouse, major illnesses, trouble with children at home, and, I don't know why I'm getting emotional here, but to see their lives on the line and how the church community ministered to them. You know, I don't know if that's big S or small s, but it's a major thing. And again, so for me, in the midst of this $8 million capital campaign, I see the value of that church community in a way that I have not seen it in a long time. And then I hear Jamie talk about today's young adults have to go out and seek and build their own communities. And I think, my God, how difficult and terrible is that? To build something that I feel is a natural part of who I am and what I have been gifted with. And I think about my 18 and 21-year-old sons, and they have to go out and build their own communities. How have we failed them if that's where we are? And I don't know, I don't have the insight to know how much of that is cultural and how much that is church structural, but how have we failed them if we do not have the gift of community that we can pass on to them? And yet I'm heartened also because the young woman who was here addressing us this morning with her essay, you know, because despite the failings of earlier generations, those people, the young people, they are seeking community. Okay? And as Jamie mentioned, they're untapped resources. They're already doing the work of the church, and they may not even know it. And I think that what that brings me back to is this idea of, and again, straight out of Jamie's talk, that we are already the church. And that's what we see more and more every day, I think. And, you know, and so the big news out of the Synod today, you know, finally this group of 270 Synod Fathers have come around to truths that we have experienced and known in our own lives. And that's the miracle. That's what we celebrate with that. Not that they did it, but that they finally got there. And again, NCR was born in that womb of the Second Vatican Council. That's where we sprang into being, in that seedbed. The great documents from there that identified us, the church, as the people of God. And so, yes, we are church. We are already there. We've got multiple examples of how we are not the perfect church, but that we are the church. And in our failings, we will go forward as a pilgrim church. I think that's the major takeaway that I have today. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jamie. Thank you, Heidi. Thank you, Dennis. We want to take a quick moment to wish Heidi's son, Sam, an eighth birthday today. And Heidi will be going from here to a much more, well, I don't know about more fun, but certainly a different kind of party after this. I I'm still trying to figure out exactly what a rebel within NCR means. I'll have to think about that one. We are setting up now for our panel discussion. Before I do that, I want to encourage anybody who still has questions and wants to fill out a card, put it on the back of a napkin or whatever you have in your wallet or purse, and get it into baskets or get it to staff members who will come around and pick them up. Here comes Denise. I see her walking down the aisle now. Raise those hands, raise those cards, get them in there, and we will be beginning that soon. Before we do that, though, we wanted to do a little poll of the audience, which, usually at these things they start to dwindle after lunch, but it's grown. I feel like that wedding feast where they went out and got all the people off the streets. Anyway, so I'm trying to figure out, we know that people have come from far and wide to this event, and so I want to do a quick, be loud and raucous if you're from the Chicago, Milwaukee area. If you're from the rest of any other part in the Midwest. If you're from, let's say, Texas and the deep South, Florida. Thank you, Charlie Curran. If you're from the West Coast and east or west of the mountains. Yeah, San Francisco board members, yes. If you're from the East Coast, east of, who thinks that they may have come the farthest? Yell out a town, a country, a whatever.
Martha's Vineyard.
That's good, that's good. Martha's Vineyard is a long way. We heard of Puerto Rico. Is there a Puerto Rico, someone? Yes, I would say you win. I don't know what you win, but thank you very much. We appreciate. Do you get NCR? Do you get the? You get the internet. Thank you very much. Well, we will actually, in another couple of months, we will have our printed. I'm doing this because I can't see her. We will have our print edition will also be available in an electronic version, and you in Puerto Rico will be able to see that along with everybody in the United States. So that's good news. I think we're ready for the panel. So I want to introduce the moderator of our panel and a former board member and a good friend of NCR's for a long, long time, Zini Fox.
Remember we were on that panel together at Fordham?
That's right. I was thinking about that. Yeah.
Yeah, that was interesting.
That was a trick. Yeah. And all the nervousness around that.
Oh my God.
I mean, it's
Chairs just a little bit. Go this way, get a little more.
oh, this way, this way.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So we're not
Oh, this one? Okay. We need one more chair, Dennis, so.
Oh no. Oh,
Okay.
okay. Whatever you want us to do.
Be there.
Yes, I'm there.
We're gonna,
Have a chair.
okay, we'll be obedient. Sort of. Kind.
Yes, this is mine.
we responded to. We can respond to that.
We are fine.
Are we fine?
Yes.
Good. Excellent.
Right. Whatever
Could
question.
do a Saturday Night Live ticket.
No,
So you wouldn't. I was going to say you would. But
Oh, have
I'm afraid if you didn't get all of that.
Yes. how I know. He always uses that.
Does he really?
Coherent response.
He's such an ass.
No, this guy in the second row, second den, he said, I think I'm the youngest one here. And I said, you know, but he's a good friend of mine from Milwaukee, yeah. And I think your talk was really speaking. I mean, the Women Religious is working now for the Sisters of St. Francis. They sponsor an intergenerational care center. He's working for them. And they've been kind of this lifeline back to the church. It's really amazing.
Isn't that remarkable?
It is remarkable, yeah.
I see so much of it. I want to write an article about the history of women religious at St. Vincent's Hospital in New York, working with AIDS patients in the early 80s.
Yes.
Like it's this unspoken history of how many of those women, before the doctors would touch those, the men, and they were all men at that time, so that's why I say men. These women religious were so intrepid, and they're washing the bodies of these AIDS victims.
Just little patience, please. We're making sure that our new voices, our old voices can be heard, so we're working on that. But we'll be ready with you in a minute here. Thank you very much for your patience.
Now, of course, it's a luxury condo, which is a sign of the end times. But
Well, first of all, we thank the many people who have, we thank the many people who have contributed questions. We have organized the questions so that they'll address some of the thematic concerns that arose from the audience. But before working with those, we wanted a little time for the panelists to interact with each other. So, first of all, those who were responders, those who were speakers, if you heard something in what a colleague said that you would like to ask them a question about or offer a comment about, thank you. I would invite you to do that. And I would mention that our time is limited, so we want to... I'm an academic, so... Okay. So. Okay, thank you. All right, so just to keep the comments brief, let's see how it works with these microphones, and otherwise we'll start passing this one around, which will be hard. So would someone like to begin? A response to each other. I think Teresa looked ready to speak. Good. Teresa, you look ready to speak. Me? Teresa.
Since I'm sitting in between Professor Aquino and Father Massengale, I thought there was something interesting about where their talks intersected, at least I picked it up, in the demographic trends that Dr. Aquino observed that suggest, or rather, I'm sorry, that Father Massengale observed in the Christian Science Monitor. The demographic trend line suggests the importance of investing in America's non-white youths. And it reminded me of something, and I can't remember the exact point, but that was in your talk, that just said to me, yes, they matter now, but it's like, why didn't people matter before? People should have mattered, the investment should have mattered before the demographic shift. And that investment in human beings shouldn't be reactionary. And so I have thoughts that I guess I'm still forming as to why investment tends to be reactionary and why we have to have, I think it's still a large part of that capitalistic mindset about how we have to see where a trend is going to take us financially before we're willing to do something about it. And if either of you want to speak about that, I'll pass you the mic.
I was hoping you wouldn't do that, because what came to my mind was not really pleasant. I think the thing that came to my mind about why this hasn't happened before is that there was a little slide I had in the presentation that I think people didn't quite get how radical it was and how disturbing it is. That Catholic equals white equals holy. And why didn't this happen in the connection between, look at the global South, you look at communities of color here, ultimately in a religious sense, what we're dealing with is a sense of idolatry and blasphemy, where we are saying that certain groups of people simply don't matter or don't count because they do not really unqualifiedly image God. And that another group of the pigmentationally challenged, also we believe that God is pigmentationally challenged, or that God is male, or that God is straight. And what all of those have in common is the justification of human exclusion through idolatry and blasphemy. And so why does it have to be, why don't we invest in what becomes profitable? Because profit then can trump our idolatry. I know that's kind of heavy, but that's where my mind was going. And I think that we need to, if we're going to talk about new ways of being, new faces, new voices, and new ways of being church, one of the things we have to be accountable to is how we have perverted God language in order to justify human exclusions. I mean, that. So I'm going to stop there. Keep it short.
I think what you're touching on is something that I was thinking about when Professor Aquino was speaking too, and that is that, that interplay of religion in conflict. We have so many examples of how religion adds to conflict and builds conflict. And not just in this country, we've got Christian leaders who have press conferences with county clerks from Kentucky who doesn't want to sign marriage licenses, and they can justify it through religion, in the name of God. Right. The same thing on the international scale, where we have, terrorist political organizations that, take the name of religion to fulfill horrendous things on people in parts of the world, whether it's the Middle East or Africa or wherever like that. And so, but Professor Aquino was talking about how religion can be that peace builder and that reducing conflict. And I just wonder how.
While I was listening to their contributions, I kept in thinking about the damage that has caused to many people, including me, and I do not know if we are going to agree with what I am going to say. We don't have to agree. But I need to mention this, and that is destructive dynamics of identity politics. And I must mention that because that is a phenomenon that affects deeply the U.S. society, U.S. culture and society. I'm saying that because other societies deal differently with cultural and racial diversity. I'm thinking of Guatemala, Salvador with indigenous communities, Bolivia, Ecuador with the national projects around the Summa Causai, building together a society in which we all can live well together. So it is a Brazil, indigenous community. So I'm not saying that marginalization and exclusion does not exist. I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that ways of dealing with those issues, Guatemala, I'm having those issues in mind. So they deal different. In the U.S., it's a very particular situation, the U.S. And identity politics, and I believe that until recently, keeping people relating to one another in terms of hate, disdain, carelessness, not caring about the other. This society likes to keep whites and blacks against Latinos, Latinos against this, and Latinos and blacks against the Asians, and everyone fighting for a pie. The politics of representation, the politics of identity are very heavy in this country, and I think that we have dealt with those issues very uncritically. Very uncritically. I believe that identity politics has not helped at all in the social process of healing this nation. By that I mean that there are ways by which justice can be achieved, understanding can be achieved, but we all are under the effects of global patriarchal capitalism, black and white. Women, white, black, yellow, brown, we all suffer the consequences of patriarchy no matter where we are. That is why I said the South is found in the North, and the North is very much entrenched in the South. There are billionaires living in Mexico, billionaires living in Brazil. We cannot make those wrong analytical distinctions anymore. I believe that the current situation pushes us to become more sophisticated in our analysis of things, beyond the typical identity politics analysis that was typical of the US in the 70s. We are not in the 70s anymore. We're not in the 80s anymore. We must become more sophisticated in our thinking. Globalization, global politics, capitalism has put us all on the same level, and at least in terms of women, violence against women, sexual violence, exclusion, no matter what the religion, no matter what the culture, no matter what the color of our skin, we all are under those circumstances. Identity politics, I think that there's a challenge to overcome in terms of conceptualizing how we understand each other, and especially in terms of creating stronger bonds of solidarity, because the struggle is one.
I would just echo something Dennis said earlier that stunned me, which was that the Women's Ordination Worldwide Conference was more important than the papal visit, which I immediately texted to some WOW people. But one thing I always like to connect with what Pilar is saying is that this is why we fight for the ordination of women. You know, this isn't just about equal rights, R-I-T-E-S. This is about equal rights, all kinds of rights. And that if the Roman Catholic Church, with its billion people, with its influence in every country, could say that women were genuinely, truly, authentically equal to men, the power and the pressure that would put on patriarchal cultures. It's about women suffering disproportionately from violence, from sex abuse, from poverty, from lack of education. That's what we're really fighting for. If that church could say, no, they are equal, the power that could have, you know, and that's why I keep in this fight. I don't often go to Roman Catholic Church anymore. I find it, quite frankly, to be a spiritually violent place for me because of the ban on women's ordination. But I will continue to fight no matter what, because this is a luxury to walk away from the church that we white privileged Western people have. Whereas in most of the world, women suffer because of religious teaching about women. We have to keep up that fight, regardless of where we are personally with the church. The women are counting on us.
You can move to a question. That's fine.
I think we have a few more minutes for interaction among the participants here. Is there something else that you heard in your colleagues' presentations? Teresa, is that your hand this time? How did I do that? I'm sorry.
I wanted to talk about your Professor Aquino's last comments about identity politics. I disagree that they haven't helped at all. I think some movements, like the Black freedom movement in the U.S., the civil rights movement, has gone on to inspire other movements. And even though civil rights is by no means totally accomplished in the U.S., I think that in those terms, the identity politics were not without merit. But I agree definitely about us all being under global capitalism. And one of the interesting things that I've found in the history of Black freedom movements, when they do start to shift focus, not just to racial identity, but to economic inequality, then that's when the opposition to them really, really starts to increase. And when leaders get more unpopular and when leaders get assassinated. And it is, and that's not a coincidence. Even in the Black Panther Party, when they started reaching out to the young patriots, mostly whites in Appalachia, and who said, you know, I'm not Black, but I get it. I'm oppressed because of economic inequality, and the FBI's target on them just shot up. And that's when you see groups destroyed. So it takes a lot of awareness of this and staying awake, staying alert, and I think it is really, it is important for us to recognize our own oppression under global capitalism. If we were all able to unite under that, a very serious shift would take place, and there are plenty of people in power, actually a very few people in power, but that have enough power to fear losing it and always try to do something about it at that point.
I would just agree what I was hearing from some of the panel members as well, that I certainly am on board with issues of gender equality and justice and racial equality and justice for people of all sexual orientations. But I do think sometimes the issue of class injustice is one of the biggest elephants in the room that we don't talk about. But I will say, I do think in its history, NCR has been covering that issue all along, even before the Pope made it cool to talk about the poor. So I'm happy to say that's true about NCR.
Well, thank you for engaging each other in this way. You'll see that some of these questions are general, and I invite anyone who wants to speak to them, and some are quite specific to one person or another. So, and they're arranged in a random order that we sorted out at lunchtime. First of all, thinking globally is important, but it is difficult when we, in our own city, there are African American churches, Latin American churches, and in quotes, white churches. It seems that we need to work locally to bring these communities together. Do you have any suggestions for us? It is not an easy question. It is not an easy question.
I mean, isn't some of it the history of like housing issues, is that we live in separate communities, so that's partially why we worship in separate communities.
It's like keeping alive it is, I mean, it just, my impression is that sometimes people just love to keep alive a divided society. So we have Latino, that's exactly what we have been talking about. Latino churches, black churches, Asian churches, no matter how small they are, and black churches, white churches. At times, I just think that feature of U.S. society has also a lot to do with this country, and let's face it, philosophy and politics have been deeply shaped by Protestantism. And the tendency has been divisionism, fragmentation, fragment create as many churches as you can. One participant here was telling me earlier, I can found a church wherever you tell me. My father did it, I can do it. This is a woman here, the audience. Really? Had the power to do that? My God. So, in my Latin American culture, we are not used to think in those terms.
Well, we can't get beyond divisionism unless people are honest about the reasons for the problem. And I mean, I love you, Pilar. And I know, okay. Yeah. But the thing is, I hate this question because I keep getting it all the time. And part of me wants to say, if you want black and brown and white Catholics to get together, then why don't you get them to do it? Okay, it's not that difficult. The problem is that integration, mixed race communities are the last thing that many Catholics really want. Right. Let's be honest about that. It's the last thing that many Catholics really want. And if they do, they want people of color to come out to the suburban places. They certainly don't want to go down into those bad neighborhoods. Right. So let's be honest about what's keeping us apart. That we really wanted that, we could easily make it happen. Now, part of what makes my frustration, but my pain, is that as a Catholics, we belong to a worldwide communion. We belong to a communion which, by profession, says that every human identity that we hold, whether it's gender-based or race-based or class-based, or by how we love, that's all relativized through baptism. That fundamentally we should all be one in Christ Jesus. And yet, the original sin of U.S. Catholicism is that U.S. Catholics became white by adopting the racial codes of this country. That was the price of acceptance. And I'm sorry for going on like this.
When you say Catholics became white by accepting the code, you're talking about like Irish and Italians?
Absolutely, yes. Right. The Irish and Italian Catholics, remember, the part of the melting pot of America was that the way in which you got to be accepted was you became as indistinguishable as possible from the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant majority. Right. WASP. And so Catholics bought into that. The price of being accepted, primarily Italian and Irish Catholics, was to become as indistinguishable as possible from the white majority. And part of showing your loyalty to America was that we became, not we, many of our ancestors became white. And that racial division is what plagues us. So there's no secret to having integrated communities. We could easily have them. But do we really, really want it? That's the question. And then are we willing to die to false identities? You're right, Pilar. This country, its craziness, its racial insanity, that we treat it as ultimately real. Are we willing to die to that in order to really be reborn again? And unless we're willing to do that, then all this kind of visiting back and forth will be cosmetic. It'll make people feel good, but won't ultimately change what's really going on in America.
I was just one example came to my mind when Brian says, if we wanted to do it, we could. This story's a couple years old, so maybe you've heard it before. But the bishop of Tulsa, Oklahoma, is a parish in Tulsa that has gradually, it's a growing parish, but again, the growing population is Hispanic immigrants who are moving into that parish, and he found a Spanish-speaking priest that could take care of both the Anglo and the Hispanic community in there. It came time for confirmation, and the Anglo community in this parish wanted their kids confirmed in English Mass, and they said the Spanish can do it in Spanish because they like Spanish. And the bishop said, no, it's one parish, it's one confirmation, it'll be a bilingual Mass. And that's what he did. And it didn't end quite that easily because there was, as you can imagine, things went on. But I think that might be an example of if we want to do it, we can.
Jamie discussed some of the signs of hope that she sees in young adults. And so I would ask Father Brian and Dr. Pilar, what signs of hope do you see in the church as it refers to your presentation?
I have to say it's shocking that I'm the hopeful one here.
I thought about that too, yeah. It's amazing, that's wonderful. Signs of hope. Since Ferguson, since a year ago, August, I've been invited to over 25 different college campuses to talk about Ferguson, Staten Island, Baltimore, ... unfortunately. And what I find is that the presentations are like standing room only. That many of our young people are, one, naive about what's going on. They think that police brutality is something that just happened. And I don't know, this has been going on for a while. But they understand that it's something that they don't want to be a part of that kind of America. They don't know how to talk about it, so they're still looking for language about that, and they're still not quite sure all the language about privilege in that. But I have to say that they at least are open to that conversation in ways that I didn't think that they would be. And I think that that's, something, an ember we can blow on. And also I find out that they're not adverse to discussions of faith in connection with race. In fact, they're looking for that kind of connection. They don't want me to come and talk as a sociologist or a political scientist. They want those kind of realities, but they want to make the connection with their faith life. And they find out that the reason why I'm doing this is because I'm a Catholic, not despite of it. That's what really wakes them up. And then they want to know, well, where has that Catholicism been? And I said, well, the fact that you're asking the question is itself a sign of hope. So.
Several faces came to my mind in response to your question. So you remember the PowerPoint. It is young people involved in this, the large majority of people in those processes. And I have been in 3 world forums, Dakar, 2000, Senegal, 2011, that was Tunis too, and then meetings, regional meetings of the World Forum, Brazil, Venezuela. And it is young people, largely young people involved in that kind of movements, NGOs, organizations, students. and all of them, my impression is that it's lots of signs of hope. So to me, the future looks hopeful simply because I am seeing new generations, new faces, people. They remind me a great deal of my own times. I'm sure that most of you, as I see your hair and your faces, you must be very much like me. So we grew up during the early 70s and during the early 80s, the social struggles, the student movement. It was true for the US, it was true for Latin America. So I worked for Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala in those years. I was a nun in those years. I was a religious. So I don't regret a minute of it. But I was an activist heavily involved in the revolutionary processes in Latin America, the liberation, the Church of Medellin, the Church of Puebla. So the liberation theology, the early movement of liberation theology, I'm the result of those movements. And then today, when I see so many young people involved in this process, they all get together around a commonality of interests and goals. For some, it is simply survival in context of violence. Many young people in Mexico, for example, my country is being doomed by violence and drug lords and so forth, as you know. So in Mexico, young people get together to find ways, strategies, survival against violence. And then I have very much in mind my many friends and people from Palestine. It is young people. It is the young students, the student movement, resisting, keeping their people strong when their homes are being demolished every day, when their children are being killed every day for no reason at all, simply because they just want to be expelled from their own land. Palestinians. It is young people, women and men and children. So I think that there are many signs of hope around the world.
Since that had excluded you, Jamie, the next question was to you. Can you be a bit more specific about how to get youth drawn back toward the church?
More specific about how to get youth back into church. I think the best model is the one I presented from America Magazine, called Christ and the Cooks. It's available online. You can just Google Christ and the Cooks America and it will come up, and I think it's one of the best explanations of how to connect small s and large s sacraments.
We'll steal it and put it on our website so you don't have to go someplace.
Yeah, let's just take ownership of it. But I think that really the larger issue is I don't think we're going to get them back in droves. I just don't. I think we have to go beyond the walls of the church. Mm-hmm. And I think this is where women religious are of great value, is they show us that their work in the world and the table of the world is sacramental work, and that this is a spiritual discipline. There's a movie called Radical Grace. Oh, good, cool. And the young woman that made that movie was not Catholic, was an atheist, but had heard about this woman religious who was doing work with the formerly incarcerated. And it blew her mind and it broke her heart open. And she said, my God, this work can be a spiritual discipline. And that's why she made that film. And she profiled 3 women religious. My point is that's where I think the future is helping young people who are working in the world see that their work is sacrament. And I don't think, ultimately does it matter if they come to the rituals or not. I don't think it does. I think it's about finding the sacred in our very midst. And I think that's what they need. So many young people burn out in social service fields. They burn out within a matter of years because they don't have what women religious had. They don't have communities of support, prayer, self-care. They don't have those resources that have sustained women religious to do this kind of work into their 80s and 90s. I think that's really what the answer is.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that echoed what you said. I'm not sure if the goal is ultimately to bring young people into church as church is presently configured.
Right. Just true. Yeah.
Now, I agree with you that we need to expand what we mean by church If by church we mean a community that's been inspired by and captivated by the ministry and mission of Jesus, then that is what we need to invite people into. And if we can celebrate Eucharist in a way that connects meaningfully people with the ministry and mission of Jesus, yes, that's what we want to invite young people into. I'm not so sure that we should invite young people into church as it's presently configured. And I'm just not sure about that, because I think for many young people, they can find, and for others, some not so young people, they can find that pretty toxic. And so, yeah, but that we need to provide communities of support and that keep the memory of Jesus alive. That's what we need to do. And we need to find creative ways then of being, how do we gather to tell the story? And it doesn't have to be on Sunday at 8, 9:30, and 11.
That's true.
I think we have to expand our horizons about what that looks like. But I also know that young people are hungry for Jesus. But I'm not sure that our present church is going to be the place where they're going to find it.
Agree?
I would just say that I agree with both of you in terms of that, but I also have respect for whoever wrote that question and is wondering about how to get young people back into church as it is not perfectly configured by any stretch of the imagination. But because I think that probably for that person and for many people, it's been really meaningful for them. And there's a concern that a generation who is finding community in things that maybe aren't always so wonderful, like my community is that I'm a Mac person instead of a PC person or something like that, that you're wanting, the questioner is saying there's something of value here, and I'm sad that some people of a certain generation might be missing out on it. So I agree with you, but would want to hold that tension of how can we rescue what's great about the church. And maybe it's going to look different for future generations, though.
Yeah, I don't mean to have disrespect for people who found that its value and want to pass that on. I think there is a real ache that's there and a real pain because, yeah, as you were saying, there have been things about church that we have been life-giving. And how do you pass that? And the pain is that the present configuration of the church gets in the way of passing that message on, passing on that value. That's where, anecdotal story, I teach at Marquette University, and it never fails that sometimes during the semester, someone will raise the question, Father Massengale, you seem really smart and really intelligent, so why are you a priest? Now, listen to the question. And so I always ask them, okay, I'm more than willing to answer the question, but why do you pose them as if they're polar opposites? And then the conversation really begins. Because what they're experiencing in my classroom and what I'm teaching is not what they're experiencing when they go to church. And so I don't mean to be dismissive, and if I came across that way, please don't be offended. But I'm just simply echoing the group that I work with every day. They're not experiencing church the way many of us would want to pass on. That's not what they're experiencing. And trying to find those places, people come to, where can I go to Mass? Where they can get that kind of experience. And the fact is that we have to answer that question and say, well, maybe there's a short list of maybe 2 or 3 in my diocese. It speaks to where we are right now.
I'd just say super quickly that the current model, I think, is configured based on a village model, a communal model of society. That's how it's been configured. That's when it worked. Was when we were living in villages and communities, and the large parish just supported that. But with an individualistic model of society, these gargantuan parishes just don't support young people. I don't think they need that intimacy, that presence, that community, that conversation You know, you hear young people say, I need mass and something else. So the cooking class was the something else, or get them a pizza, or let them go bowling. Why? Because they want to communicate, because then if they do, the Eucharist makes sense. So.
I get that question too, but not from my students, from fellow faculty. So I'm not at a Catholic school, and I get, you seem pretty smart and pretty cool. Why are you Catholic?
Yep. Yep.
Clearly a topic that we could spend quite a bit more time with, but I think the next one also is challenging. How can we weave care for creation into new ways of being church?
I did an article on Elizabeth Johnson for NCR when her book Ask the Beasts came out. And she kept saying, we have to be converted to the earth. And this was a year before Laudato Si came out. We have to be converted to the earth. You know, and for me, and I think she would share this, one thing that drives me crazy is we have these social justice meetings and the social justice committee and all of this. And at the end of the meeting, all of these plastic bottles go in the garbage.
Oh my
right?
gosh.
It drives you crazy. So I think one of the most basic ways we have to do it is if you pride yourself as being a social justice Catholic, then you need to be converted to the earth. And everything you have to do, you do. Even your basic activities need to respect the earth. Everything from your plasticware to your paper plates to the way you deal with your bottles. I think just even on that small level, showing a consciousness of what you're doing. So many times we're social justice Catholics except for that issue or that issue. We need to integrate what social justice really means, I think.
I agree. I think a lot of the speakers today have talked about care for other people, and one of the ways that we can care for other people is being aware of environmental justice issues and food justice issues. These are among the things that are often tied in with economic inequality and with racial segregation. You know, usually if you live in a neighborhood that is predominantly poor or predominantly Black or Latino, your access to food, to healthy food, is not going to be as good as that of someone who's in a more affluent neighborhood, and that's wrong. If you live, again, in these economically disadvantaged neighborhoods, then you're more likely to live by a plant that can toss toxic waste into a river or a water source near you and make you sick. And again, that's wrong. And so one of the ways that we care about other people is by getting involved with and caring about these issues that affect them and that also happen to affect the earth.
In terms of ways of understanding, in terms of how do we shape ways of thinking and create new worldviews on young people and everyone in the Catholic community. The first thing I think is that we must learn to be humble. Humble in the sense that others have been doing the work way before us. I'm thinking of the extensive work and the powerful documents that have been issued by the World Council of Churches on care for creation, integrity of creation, peace, justice, and integrity of creation. They have whole programs. And I'm saying that because in my teaching, I teach Catholic social teaching and the social justice agenda of the World Council of Churches. And my students love it. And they love, and I think that we Catholics have the tendency to not know what others are doing, and then Catholics have the tendency to say, I discovered it, I'm the first. That is not true. So Protestants have been doing the work way before us, along the lines of environmental justice. Secondly, feminist theologians have been for decades doing the work. Plenty of literature out there and plenty of projects out there. Feminist Catholics doing the work from Chile, Conspirando, the group Conspirando, my colleagues, feminist theologians in Chile, and going through Brazil, I can, I look at the Americas and I see Colombia, I see works, I see people, projects, working on publications, booklets, magazines, books on Yvonne Guevara. She's the most famous one known here in the U.S., but in the U.S., we have plenty of feminist Catholic feminist theologians doing work along the lines of environmental justice. The only ones which remain behind all the time is the hierarchy. They're always behind because Donald Dorr, the Irish missionary, who was a missionary in Africa, he's no longer a missionary, but he writes extensively on Catholic social teaching. Decades ago, he said, the Catholic Church is very much behind, is stuck on issues of environmental justice. The Catholic hierarchy have never cared about the environmental justice. It's very true. The only one is the most prominent one, I will think, is the encyclical of Pope Francis. That is the only one. So now, I got the charge from the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians to put together a book about that contribution, edited book for collecting the contribution of Pope Francis. But in general, the hierarchy has really not done anything. So I think that Catholics must begin by saying what others are doing, what can we learn from feminist theologians, ecofeminist theology, the World Council of Churches on Environmental Justice, and then we can add our voice to that. Humble.
As you can see, we have a lot more questions. We have about 2 more minutes. I'm going to pose one of these to you and ask that as many of you as possible say something to this, and but keep it very short. So, in order to get peace and justice, we need a culture of forgiveness. How can we make the habit of forgiveness common in our way of living as Catholics?
It's I think one of the most helpful things I've ever read, and I'm going to put a plug in for my own book, forgive me. I did it's not my book, but it's a collection of Margaret Farley's essays that we just did with Orbis Books. I wrote the introduction to it, but there she talks about anticipatory forgiveness. So it's the idea that how do you forgive when there is not any movement toward any kind of reconciliation on the other party's part? How do you stand in that tension that the violence or the injustice is still going on, but that your peace is no longer disturbed? And so I would just giving you homework, I would invite you to actually take a look at that. It's one of the best pieces, I think, for Catholics who are still very angry with the institution, because there is so much justice that still needs to be done. I love this talk about mercy. I laugh every time I hear it. We need justice in this church, not mercy. We don't need mercy for things that we're not sinning for. My mother didn't need mercy for divorcing. She was in an abusive relationship. I don't need mercy for being in love with a woman. I don't need it. We need justice. So anyway, homework.
One of the ways that we think we can do it is by reflecting on the powerful example of anticipatory forgiveness that we've already experienced. For example, Charleston. The day after Charleston and that massacre, when the murderer was being arraigned, and representatives of all 9 families, each one, stood up in public court and said, "I forgive you." Now, let's think about that. Their world had been ripped apart. He expressed no remorse. They were in tears, and yet each one could stand and say, "I forgive you." Now, they want justice. They don't want him to walk free. when we've seen that dynamic over and over again, and it's been present in the African American experience, not always, but a lot. And so I think if we want to create a culture of forgiveness, we need to look at the examples that are there already and just stand in humility and in amazement at people who are able to forgive the unthinkable, the unimaginable, but yet they do. And it's real. That culture of forgiveness is already present among us. We just simply need to be in humility and sit there with it.
I agree that culture of forgiveness is there. I will say quickly, though, that I am tired of African Americans leading it. And to plug my own column, you can go back and read about that. I was very bothered by how quickly the Charleston shooter was forgiven.
Exactly.
And I think it's really problematic. And I think that Christians actually following the example of Jesus Christ don't have to do it. I don't begrudge forgiveness for giving yourself personal peace, but as a society working towards reconciliation, you can't have reconciliation until somebody else recognizes the wrong that they've done and repents for it. So
Yeah.
I think we need to, it's a very tight tension to hold, but I think we need to.
First of all, I'd like to thank all those who submitted questions and apologize that our time was so brief. These were excellent questions, and they brought about a really fine dialogue with our presenters, our responders, these wonderful visionaries for the church. And I thank each of you for your participation.
Just one thing, there have been several requests from the audience for copies of the papers delivered today, and so I will be asking the speakers for copies of their speeches and permission to put them on our website, and we'll just watch the website and we'll let you know.
Why don't you use this one?
Dennis just stole my line, so I guess all I can say is 15-minute break for everybody. Oh, and I was sitting down there listening to this, and I thought, you know, a couple bottles of wine, and this would be just an incredible dinner party. Am I right? Thank you very much for this great panel. 15 minutes, 15 minutes.